Hearing me okay. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Tasha Poinsett, and I'm here with Josh and Verena as well. And we're, yeah, just excited to have the chance to chat with you all today about Colorado's program for natural medicine and where we're at just about 2 weeks out from the state starting to open licensure. So exciting moment. I'm going to share my screen quickly. Oops. All right. So a quick overview of what we're going to be going through today. Going to start with some introductions, talk about Colorado's framework, specifically dive into rules for healing centers, training, facilitation, and then cultivation, manufacture, and testing. I will say that there's hundreds of pages of rules for this program, so we're not going to be able to get into equal depth on everything, as you can imagine. And so we'll emphasize some of the areas more, I'd say focusing a little more on healing centers and facilitator training and facilitation, partially because those are just the most complex areas of the rules with really hundreds of pages dedicated to that. And then cultivation, manufacture, and testing is a little bit more condensed, but we will kind of address broadly all of those areas, and then finishing up with just some additional considerations on the legal and business side as we think about this new program. And so you all have access to the Q&A function. Feel free to be throwing questions in as we go through the presentation. So starting out with a little bit of context about who we are. As I mentioned, my name is Tasha Poinsett. I am the Colorado Director for the Healing Advocacy Fund, a nonprofit that is working to support the implementation of these state access models for psychedelic therapies. And I'm also joined here today with Josh Capel, if you want to introduce yourself quickly.
Hey everyone, thanks Tasha. My name is Joshua Capel. I'm a policy director at the Healing Advocacy Fund and also one of the founding partners at Vicente LLP. And one of the drafters of the Natural Medicine Health Act, and have been working diligently with Tasha and others, on implementation for quite some time now, and appreciate everyone being here.
And then Verena as well, who was having tech issues. So Verena, do you want to?
Can you guys hear me?
Sure. Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Yes.
Sorry about that, guys. My name is Brina Majewska. I'm counsel at Vicente. I co-lead the psychedelic practice group with Josh. And yeah, we've been pretty intimately involved with the implementation of the regulated program over the last year or so. So great to be here with you guys.
Thanks, Verena. And so some context about Healing Advocacy Fund. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization working to expand and protect safe, affordable, state-regulated access to psychedelic healing for all who need it. And really, as of now, our work is focused in 2 states, Oregon and Colorado, which are the first 2 states in the country to create these state legal pathways for psilocybin therapy. And a lot of our work is focused on helping bring information and lessons learned from Oregon's process into Colorado as we implement the program here. And so trying to serve as a bridge across these 2 states, and then also share learnings from Colorado back to Oregon as well. So we really hope this can be a reciprocal relationship that kind of benefits both of the states moving forward. So some high-level context about the state-regulated programs, and this might be, just a refresher for very many of you on the call, but for those that are a little less familiar, both of the state programs in Oregon and Colorado are really designed around this 4-step process for people to be able to access the healing potential of psilocybin therapy with supportive care. So the 4 steps in the process are initially somebody who's interested in having an experience with psilocybin through this state-regulated model would reach out to a healing center or a facilitator and complete a screening and assessment process to identify if they have any underlying risk factors that might put them at higher risk from consuming psilocybin, as well as matching with a facilitator who's really a right fit for them in what their goals are, what their needs may be in terms of their mental health and medical history, and somebody who is well prepared to support them through what might be a really intense and challenging experience. The second step in the process is preparation, where the facilitator meets with the participant to explain the process, fill out paperwork, provide a bunch of information about what the effects of psilocybin may be, and help that person really set goals and intentions for their experience. And then the third step is administration, where the participant actually consumes the psilocybin and does so with the supervision and support of this trained facilitator who's with them throughout the experience. And then finally, integration is the last step, and that's where the participant and the facilitator meet after the session to discuss what came up during the administration session and really hone in on what are those learnings that they can take forward into their life following that experience. And any of these steps could be repeated multiple times. And so it's not to say that there's only one prep, administration, or integration session, but there is a requirement for all these 4 steps to be included for access within this licensed framework. And so a few things about the license framework that I think are really important to highlight. So the intention here is really to find a pathway to balance safety and access. So on the safety side, you have that 4-step process that I just described. You have training of facilitators by state-approved programs and licensure for facilitators. You have clearly outlined standards of practice that comes with an accountability piece. And so there's a recourse in the case of any abuse that might occur. There's a process for complaints. And then, on the positive side, there's just a really clear framework for what is ethical facilitation practice. And then, of course, there's regulation of the natural medicine itself and laboratory testing and adverse event reporting to track any safety issues that are arising. On the access side, and I think this is really important to note because a lot of people get confused about this in the licensed models, this is not a diagnosis or prescription model for access. So anyone who's 21 and up can seek access through these state programs, and they don't need a note from their doctor to do it. They don't need to be seeking access for a specific reason. So there could be a whole host of different reasons why somebody is seeking out a facilitated experience, and all of them are okay. They just need to be within the framework of that 4-step process. And then in terms of the medicine itself, we're only talking about cultivated mushrooms for this program in both states. No synthetics are allowed under these state models. And I think that's on the access side important as well, because we're really not talking about, like a synthesized formulation of some compound. We're talking about mushrooms themselves. Another note is that clinical licensure is not required for somebody to become trained and licensed as a facilitator. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on, but that's key to note. You don't need to be a therapist. You don't need to be a physician to work as a licensed facilitator. Group sessions are allowed, and then also remote preparation and integration is allowed. However, administration does need to be done in person. So in Colorado, voters passed in November of 2022 the Natural Medicine Health Act, which really did 3 things. The first piece is what I've just described. It created a framework for this regulated access program, and it gave the state 2 years to set up all the rules and regulations for that program. And we're right at the end of those 2 years now, which is why the program will soon be going live. It also decriminalized the personal use of 5 naturally occurring psychedelic substances for adults 21 plus. And that piece actually took effect in December of 2022. So it's been almost 2 years now as well. And then finally, Proposition 122 included a number of civil protections for licensed professionals to be able to participate in this program without threat to their licensure. And that's a really important piece of this, because there are clearer protections in Colorado's law for somebody who is a licensed clinician to become trained and licensed as a facilitator without risk to their other licensure. And in addition to what's laid out in the law in terms of protections, we've heard a lot of reassurance from the administrators of this program within the state that there's a lot of conversation behind the scenes with the other licensing boards to get clear that this is something that's legally allowed and legally protected. And then in addition to that, there's a number of civil protections. So for instance, it can't be a factor in a child custody case if somebody is using natural medicines within what's made legal by the law. and a bunch of other civil protections along those lines. One key thing to note here is that this is not a dispensary or retail model. Nobody within the regulated access framework can purchase psilocybin and take it home and use it without that 4-step structure that we described, or that I described. So in terms of how the program is regulated in Colorado, the regulations are overseen by 2 state agencies. The first agency is DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, which licenses both training programs and psilocybin facilitators. And we included here the link to their website. There's a whole bunch of information there. You can sign up for updates from them. So definitely recommend going to that link, checking it out, and seeing the resources available there. And then the second state agency is the Department of Revenue, which licenses all of the natural medicine businesses. So that includes healing centers, cultivation, manufacture, and testing labs, the last of which is also certified by CDPHE, or the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And again, included the link to the website. They've got a whole bunch of resources. Recommend signing up directly for updates from them if you're interested in participating in this program moving forward. So in terms of the timeline, as I mentioned, we're about 2 years into the process. A whole lot has happened. There have been 2 boards created to advise on this program, the Natural Medicine Advisory Board, as well as a federally recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Community Working Group. And the rulemaking is final for the vast majority of the program. However, there are still changes being contemplated, and there could still be changes down the line as the program rolls out and more information becomes available. But the state is currently on track to open licensure beginning on December 31st of this year. And we expect that the first manufacturers, cultivators, and testing labs will likely start to get licensure in the spring, and then healing centers can then become operational in the summer of 2025. Those are estimates, so we'll see exactly how it unfolds. So I want to dive in a little bit more specifically on healing centers. And this image is of a healing center in Portland, Oregon called the Cora Center. I just want to give you a sense of what types of spaces we might be thinking about when we talk about a healing center. So there are 2 types of healing center licenses in Colorado, a healing center and a micro healing center. We get a lot of questions of like, okay, what's the difference between this? I heard a question recently, like, is a micro healing center for microdoses? And I could see the confusion, but no, that's not the case. Really the key difference between a healing center and a micro healing center is the limit on storage of the natural medicine, which is delineated in terms of milligrams of total psilocin. And so a healing center that is storing 750 milligrams or less of total psilocin qualifies as a micro healing center. And that's something that they would indicate when they submit their application, that they're going for that licensure and they're going to adhere to that storage limit. And then with that comes somewhat less stringent security requirements. So in both cases, the natural medicine itself does need to be stored in a secure, locked place and monitored by video surveillance. But in a regular healing center, there is a requirement for a full video surveillance system and full alarm system for the building, whereas the micro healing center, it's really focused on just monitoring the psilocybin itself with a single video surveillance, which could be, you know, like a cell phone camera or something similar. And then healing center also has a requirement for a restricted area, which is an area that is only going to be accessible to certain authorized people, and that's where both the natural medicine is going to be stored as well as the client records. Micro healing centers don't have that requirement for a restricted area. And part of that is responsive to the fact that a lot of micro healing centers might be, for instance, at a licensed therapist office where there isn't necessarily the same flexibility in terms of the space. And then finally, with all of this comes a higher licensing fee for healing centers, a little bit lower for micro healing centers. And the goal of the micro healing center was to create an option for existing practices to be able to add psilocybin therapy within the context of their broader process with a little bit lower kind of barriers to entry and less expense associated with it, given that their whole business isn't necessarily going to be focused on psilocybin. What these 2 have in common, however, is that it's the same application process and the rules for facilitation at both is identical. So a few requirements of healing centers. There's a requirement that, and this is for both types moving forward, the requirement that they employ or contract with at least one facilitator. There were some questions asked of Department of Revenue whether a training license holder, which is something we'll get to later on, could qualify for that. And they seem to be indicating that yes, which is a good thing because that will allow healing centers to become licensed and operational faster, given that most people entering the space will be training license holders, at least initially. There's a requirement for diagrams of licensed premises. Once the healing center is operational, healing centers are responsible for protecting the privacy of participant records, providing an environment reasonably free of risk. There's an age restriction for the space during administration sessions that nobody under 21 can be present. And then there's kind of a whole host of requirements around standard operating procedures, that the healing centers have an administration session preparedness plan, an emergency plan that they keep on site, and there are required record keeping, signage, and disclosures that they need to be providing to participants so that they have access to kind of the basic safety information and the basic parameters of licensed facilitation. And then finally, there's a requirement for healing centers to have an environmental, social, and governance plan, which is pretty broadly defined, but is basically just requiring that they show that they have a plan geared towards one of those three areas and that they're actively working towards environmental, social, or governance kind of responsibility in their operations. A few things that healing centers shall not do. They can't be transferring natural medicine to people that aren't participants in administration sessions. They can't allow participants to take natural medicine off-site. Consumption of alcohol or cannabis is not allowed on the licensed premise of a healing center. And they also can't further change the form of natural medicine once they've received it, except they are allowed to mix the natural medicine or psilocybin. I use those interchangeably in this presentation. They are allowed to mix it with juice or water or prepackaged food or beverage. So that's a lot about the restrictions. What can healing centers do? So there is actually a lot of flexibility as well in the rules, which is something that we've really advocated for, recognizing that there are different orientations to this work, and people really want the freedom to operate in a way that aligns with their values and their goals for why they're participating in this program. And so there is flexibility for use of the space when it's not being used for administration sessions. Which is helpful in terms of kind of the business viability as well, that it doesn't have to be used for just that one use as long as the natural medicine itself is secured. There are options for individual or group sessions with a specific participant to facilitator ratio specified. Indoor or outdoor administration is allowed. That might vary somewhat by the local jurisdiction rules, so that's something to keep an eye on. And then there's really pretty broad freedom regarding how these spaces are set up, what are the kind of interior design elements, and then also the facilitation style itself. So, you know, using music, using sound bowls, having these other elements are allowed. And then I mentioned at the beginning that there is this working group on the federally recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Peoples Working Group. There is a really strong emphasis in the law with in terms of avoiding cultural appropriation or exploitation. And so that really does need to be something that people keep in mind as well and follow the work of that group to understand how they can ensure that they're avoiding that specifically in setting up these spaces and facilitation. And a few other things that are allowed, prepackaged food as well as fresh fruits and vegetables can be provided during administration. With a retail license, prepared food may be provided after administration. Again, you can mix natural medicine with water or juice. There's no residency restrictions for owning or operating a healing center. And then the healing center can co-locate with other natural medicine businesses, as well as other businesses more broadly. So a question that often comes up is about the fees. How much is this all going to cost? We do not have fees from DORA yet, which is the fees for facilitation licensure, but we do have fees on the business side from Department of Revenue. And so these values shown here are combining both the application fee and the compliance fee. So it's showing you the total amount that it's going to cost for year one. And so for a micro healing center, for the healing center itself, it's $3,000. Then each owner of that healing center is also going to have to pay either $750 or $500, depending on whether they're an owner who's also licensed as a facilitator. So I have a couple of examples here that, you know, for somebody who's a licensed facilitator and an owner of a micro healing center, they would pay $3,500 to Department of Revenue plus whatever they owe to DORA. And happy to dig in a little bit more in the Q&A if any of this feels unclear. All right, diving into facilitator training. Sorry. So there are two full scope facilitator license types in Colorado, clinical facilitator and facilitator. And the key distinction between these is somebody who's a clinical facilitator is licensed to diagnose and treat mental health and medical conditions through a separate licensure. So some examples of that would be MD, advanced nurse practitioner, LPC, LAC, LCSW, anybody who within their scope of practice can diagnose and treat. And those people can provide natural medicine services for purpose of treating physical or mental/behavioral health conditions. And that's actually spelled out in rule, which is a really big difference from Oregon's program. There are also facilitators, which is anyone who doesn't hold one of those license types that allows them to diagnose and treat. And they cannot practice medicine or psychotherapy, and they can hold another license in a healthcare or wellness field. So this does include a few healthcare professionals such as nurses, naturopathic doctors, as well as acupuncturists and other licensed professionals, or people who don't hold a separate license but have completed the required training for the program. And then the education requirements for both of these types are the same. Although there are some accelerated options available to certain people, and both groups can integrate their secondary licensure if they have it within their natural medicine practice, with some restrictions specifically around physical touch. For instance, for licensed massage therapists, they can't integrate the full scope of physical touch within the administration sessions. So the required training for both types of facilitators at a baseline is 150 hours of coursework, which can be done remotely or in person, 40 hours of supervised practice, which includes at least 30 hours in person, 40 hours of consultation while actively providing natural medicine services, and completion of a basic life support training. And now there's a note here that a training license is required to complete both the in-person administration hours, which are part of the practicum, as well as the consultation piece. And that training license is something that people can apply for after they've completed the didactic portion, and it's valid for up to 2 years. So diving in a little bit more on the consultation piece, because we get a lot of questions about this as well. I do want to say that the rules for this are not final and are still subject to change. But essentially what this is somebody begins to practice natural medicine facilitation with their training license while they are completing consultation work with somebody who has more experience in the facilitation of natural medicine services. And this can include case review, for instance, things that are coming up as they're starting to work with clients. And the focus is going to be on these 6 areas that I've laid out here. And within the rules, there's more specified in terms of how exactly these different areas are addressed and reflected in that requirement around consultation. But the consultation groups themselves can be up to 10 people, and they can be done remotely with whoever the consultant is. The definition of consultant is still being defined, so unfortunately we can't answer that for you right now. So as I mentioned, there's that baseline training pathway that I outlined earlier. And then there are accelerated options for both for people who have what's called legacy experience or significant experience practicing with psilocybin specifically prior to the application for licensure, a minimum of 200 hours and working with a minimum of 40 participants. And then there's also an accelerated training pathway for people that have completed prior training that's essentially equivalent to the state requirements. Really, what we're hearing from the state agencies or from DORA is that it's up to the discretion of the training programs to decide on those parameters for accelerated licensure. And so anyone who's applying for a training program and thinks that they might qualify, you'd need to be asking the training program what they offer in that regard, and then really making sure that, you know, that's been vetted and approved and that they've been in conversation with DORA, which I know that they're all trying to do. And also just, I think we all need to carry a bit of grace in this process because a lot of the details are still being finalized. And so everybody's working together to try to get more clarity into how this fits together. In terms of a training program, so there are currently 10 programs approved in the state of Colorado. And just a note, I will share the slide deck out. We will share it out after this presentation, so you'll be able to peruse this in a bit more depth. But these are the logos for the 10 approved programs, and we expect to see a few more come online soon. So rules for facilitation. DORA is finalizing currently a set of recommended forms and disclosures that would be used during the facilitation process. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but DORA does currently have a draft of each of these forms you see listed that they will be finalizing sometime in the near future. And these forms, it's important to know, are not going to be required forms in the sense that like healing centers or facilitators can adjust them, but if they do use these forms, then they do know that they're in compliance with the minimum information that needs to be protected collected, as well as information they need to be providing to participants to ensure informed consent and an understanding of what participants are engaging in with this program. So one of the key forms is a safety screen, which DORA, again, is providing a model form for. And their model form is something that was created by a group of practitioners, mostly affiliated with the UC health system, that came together to decide kind of on a set of questions that should be asked of people to really understand their health history, mental health, medical, pharmacology, history of psychedelic use, and of course, reason for seeking access, to have an ability to then direct them to additional consultation if it's needed, or make sure that the facilitator is a right fit for them. So the rules also lay out a pretty comprehensive set of requirements around this screening process. And I think this looks maybe a little more complicated than it is. But basically, every participant is going to be administered a screening form. And if that screening form identifies a risk factor, whether physiological or a mental health indication that could put them at higher risk from the use of psilocybin, there's going to be a couple of requirements depending on the facilitator's training. So if it's a clinical facilitator that they're wanting to work with, and that risk factor is within the clinical facilitator's scope of practice, that clinical facilitator needs to reach out to their treating provider unless there's good cause not to. And good cause would include if the treating provider is contracted with the federal government. And once they've completed that step, they can proceed with preparation session, of course, making sure that they're working with the participant to develop a safety plan around that risk that was identified. And then if a risk is identified that is outside of either a clinical facilitator or a facilitator's scope of practice, there are 3 options to be able to proceed with services. The participant can either receive a referral, clearance, or complete a consultation and risk review with a medical or behavioral health provider. If they do that last option, the consultation and risk review, the facilitator needs to maintain documentation of the completion of that risk review, as well as obtain informed consent from the participant to move forward with preparation, and then work with them to create a safety plan. Once one of those is completed, then they may proceed with a preparation session. So there's a few guardrails in terms of administration that are worth highlighting. There are minimum session lengths laid out by the state, 3 3 to 5 hours, depending on the dose. The dosage itself, in Colorado, there's not currently a max dosage limit, but there is a requirement that dosage must meet generally accepted standards of practice, and that dosing be determined based on screening and consultation with the participant. And then there's a lot more laid out in terms of appropriate relational boundaries between facilitator and participant, and a requirement that participants have a safe transportation plan home after the session, which can't involve them self-operating a car. In terms of preparation, the main requirements are that a facilitator describes the risk, benefits, and range of possible effects of psilocybin, discuss the participants' motivations for seeking natural medicine services, complete a support touch contract, and complete any outstanding forms and disclosures. Part of what I want to emphasize here is that the program is actually not that prescriptive in terms of what preparation has to look and feel like, beyond sort of these basic parameters that are geared towards safety and information for the participant. Integration, the requirement is that the facilitator cannot charge a separate fee for the first integration session. It has to be included in the cost. And then during the integration session, they have to conduct a review of the administration session and evaluate the participant and their reaction to the session, and recommend follow-up care and referrals as appropriate. So again, not super prescriptive, but sort of just the basics are outlined. And then it's, I think, comes to the facilitator training process to really build out what is good integration. And then I'm going to actually hand it over to Josh to get into cultivation, manufacture, and testing.
Awesome, Tasha. A lot of information, and I hope everyone's ready for a lot more. So, in the regulated model, all the natural medicine has to come from regulated sources. And so there's, arguably 5 other license types: the cultivation license, the manufacturing license, and the testing license. The cultivation license is split up into 2 tiers. There's a micro cultivation license and there's a standard cultivation license. The biggest difference is how much product can be stored at one time. So with the micro cultivation license, you can store up to 750 grams of dried fruiting bodies at a time. And with the standard license, it's 5 kilograms. Now, the Department of Revenue can increase this 5 kilogram amount upon a showing of good cause. So that's something to keep in mind. The other differences between these 2 license types is there's different security requirements. The micro cultivation license doesn't have to have a fully operational security system. And then there's also fees that are different, as you see in a couple bullet points down. Cubensis is the only type of mushrooms that's permitted. And there's some rules around there's a fair amount of rules around both preventing contamination, protecting worker health, and testing that I'll highlight briefly later. And then another important thing to note on the cultivation license is that they can co-locate with other natural medicine business licenses. They can co-locate at a healing center or a manufacturing facility. You have one facility that has all 3, but there are some limitations there. Next slide. So manufacturing licenses, the cultivation of mushrooms, those mushrooms and products can go straight to a healing center or a facilitator, or they can go to a manufacturing licenses for sort of further processing. A manufacturing license is allowed to manufacture capsules or tea bags with the traditional manufacturing license, but then there's an extraction endorsement that a manufacturing license can get, and this allows them to manufacture chocolates, gummies, pressed tablets, or tinctures. The manufacturing license, there's some solvents allowed. They can use water, ethanol, or food grade oils. However, there's some limitations on sort of the process used in extraction and sort of like concentrating products. Manufacturing licenses do not have a storage limit, and there's specific rules around labeling the products, both in the harvest date, the strain types. You can't have colors and pictures on the label, and then it needs to be packaged, in 10 milligram psilocin units, or a 50 milligram package limit, or 5 grams of dried fruiting bodies. So those are sort of like the limits per product. And again, as I mentioned, you can co-locate the manufacturing license with other license types. Tasha, next slide. Testing requirements. So the testing labs, really testing labs are certified by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. You also have to have ISO accreditation, and you need a Department of Revenue license. There's testing required for potency, for different tryptamines, and for the presence of 4-ACO-DMT. And there's also testing required for certain contaminants, salmonella, E. coli, and the testing, and there's testing frequencies laid out, based off of harvest lots, which is a defined term in the regulations. Licensed labs is a big issue for a lot of us, cannot test personal use products for now. Now, unlicensed labs can test personal use products, but that's another story. But you can't co-locate a testing lab with other natural medicine business licenses, and if the owners of a testing lab can't have an ownership interest in other natural medicine business licenses. However, you can co-locate testing labs with cannabis licenses, cannabis testing lab licenses. There's a lot of other requirements in the rules. This is, could be an intimidating list, but it's really not that bad. A couple sort of notes, there's advertising and marketing restrictions, specifically around audience composition, around not appropriating federally recognized tribes or indigenous communities. Knowledge or heritage, and then there's some restrictions on the types of ingredients you can put in manufactured products. The ESG plans also apply to these license types, as Tasha mentioned. There's a laundry list of different items you can choose from. These plans will be made available publicly, and you're supposed to provide an update on the ESG plans each month. A good example of a potential ESG plan is benefit honoring, where different businesses can give back to different indigenous communities. There's also handler licenses. So anyone who's touching or holding natural medicine needs a handler license. But overall, just things to note on other requirements, applying to these license types. Next slide, Tasha. Okay, a couple other considerations. This program, is still illegal federally, sort of like our cannabis, sector that's prevalent in most states. Federal law still provides criminal and civil liability related to the manufacturing and possessing of psilocybin. We haven't seen any enforcement actions in Oregon. We haven't seen any enforcement actions in cannabis. We don't expect any enforcement actions here, but that is something to note. And this federal illegality does lead to other issues. So a couple issues to highlight for DEA registrants. There's the ability to lose your registration if it's in the public interest as defined by a court. The DEA has gone after cannabis doctors back in the day, or physicians with who were participating in euthanasia in Oregon back in the day. They lost both cases, but there is an issue there. Payer contracts, sometimes require practitioners to follow certain policies. Those policies might also link to federal law or not referring to unapproved treatments, is something to look at. Leah and her team at Delphi are really experts on that issue. With Section 280 of the tax code, overall what this section says is that you can't take necessary and ordinary business deductions to the extent you're trafficking in a controlled substance. How this would be applied to healing centers and other natural medicine businesses is currently unknown. But for those who are looking to enter into this space, understanding 280 and creating a strategy around it is very important. There is some liability insurance products out there. There with that, the strength or the scope of those policies vary. So make sure you work with a very reputable insurance broker. On banking, again, banking is an issue that's out there due to federal illegality. I do imagine there'll be some banks who step up in this space to bank with this industry. I don't have a good one off the top of my head. So if you're a bank that is working in this space or wants to open accounts, contact us and we'll give you free advertising. The immigration, for those who have unique immigration status, participating in a federally illegal business is risky, especially in light of the new administration's stance on immigration. Again, something to consider. Tasha, next slide. Okay, a couple other things to note. There's a 5 license limit for any individual or entity. So, if you're an individual and you're like, hey, I want to open up this healing center network and have, my branded healing centers all over the state. No, that's not like sort of the intent of this law. The intent was, to really have diversity of ownership. So the 5 license limit applies to healing centers, natural medicine, or healing centers, cultivation facilities, manufacturing facilities. And, and collectively you can have an interest in 5 licenses. Now, with that said, there's financial disclosures related, to, on the application process, you have to disclose all the financial interests in your license types. There's no public companies permitted, and so there's, this is something to enforce that 5 license limit. And there's no sort of threshold. If you own a fraction of a percent of a business or you have a profit sharing interest, you might be considered an owner under the eyes of the Department of Revenue. There is priority licensure for members of federally recognized tribes and indigenous communities, and also people from certain counties that aren't very populated. And so leases and mortgages is another thing, just making sure that you're not, by engaging in a federally illegal business, you're not triggering any clauses in your lease, or you're not, violating some term of your mortgage. And local governments, they're the biggest thing to know. The biggest sort of barrier to entry is like making sure you're approved with your local government from a zoning perspective. And we'll talk about that in a second. Next slide, Tasha. And here we are, local governments. So, one of the big requirements, one of the big requirements is that any licensed business is in a zone district that's like approved or not prohibited by their local government. And a lot of local governments have been taking different approaches. Some have been zoning these like their underlying business type. Like Arapahoe County is a good example. For a cultivation facility, if you could cultivate gourmet mushrooms in that zone district, you can likely cultivate medicinal mushrooms in that zone district. Or if you can make, chocolate bars in that zone district, you could likely, manufacture, psilocybin chocolate bars in that zone district. Again, you want to check each local government, and the zoning regulations specifically with the property, but that's one approach. On the healing center side, we're seeing a lot of communities treat these like medical offices. Boulder's a good example. Arapahoe County is a good example. And then with that, you have some communities that are adjusting like statewide setbacks. So Boulder, there's a statewide setback. You have to be 1,000 feet away from a daycare or a school. And Boulder decided to waive that setback because they want to make it more accessible for currently existing businesses to get a micro healing center license at their current office location. And then you have places like Colorado Springs that's talking about going the other direction, making really prohibitive setbacks. There's some communities are trying to look at creating special privileges for businesses that only have clinical facilitators. There's a big question about like whether this is ethical, especially cutting out wellness facilitators or ceremonial facilitators who might not be practicing in this sort of like medicalized model. A lot of communities also are in like a wait and see approach, and they're just letting businesses go and apply. And if you're looking to open a business in one of those jurisdictions, the advice is to apply now for zoning approval. Next slide, Tasha. Here's some things you can do now. I'm not going to go through them, but we'll send these out. We'll send these slides out to you. But the biggest thing you can do is obtain local approval. Upcoming regulations and changes. The federally recognized tribes and indigenous communities working group is putting together a report, that may influence, some of the future regulations. The DORA has a set of regulations that draft regulations that a rulemaking hearing on a couple weeks ago. They haven't finalized those yet. But since the rulemaking hearing, they have updated the draft on their website. And one of the big issues at that hearing was their original proposed draft restricted at-home administration to only palliative care. There's a lot of community. A lot of the community came out against that, and DORA listened, and then removed that from this proposed, their proposed draft. We don't know if that's going to be the final draft, but big kudos to DORA for listening to the community there. I do expect the future rules and rulemaking on at-home administration, on microdosing, so really, it's one of those things where this is an iterative process. We're going to see it, continue to change over time. So, pay attention. And I'm sure we'll be doing more webinars about it as well.
Thanks, Josh. Just going to jump in for a last couple slides here, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So this one is more sort of thematic in nature, and we just want to kind of be upfront that there's a lot of challenges with this state access model. And there's a lot of opportunities. And so, we hope that everyone thinking of participating is really clear-eyed about both. This isn't going to be easy from the start. It hasn't been easy in Oregon. It won't be easy in Colorado. And we really do think that there's an incredible opportunity here to create access to healing and pathways to healing, but also more broadly, I see it as this opportunity to fundamentally start to shift the way that we think about healing, healing as process, healing as relationship, moving away from this kind of paradigm of just addressing a list of symptoms with a list of medications and actually engaging with root causes. And for me, as I've continued to engage in conversations with people across a whole host of different backgrounds, it's been really fascinating in particular to start to have these deeper conversations with people in the medical and mental health fields that are really opening up to and interested in a change. And I think that a lot of us feel kind of a heaviness around we're just getting sicker. There's worse stats around mental illness every year. So really, whatever we're doing isn't addressing the problem. And there's an opportunity here to start to shift that and to really have kind of creativity around this process and shape something from the beginning that is values centered and that is done responsibly. And so that's kind of the third one I have here is I think with this comes a big sense of responsibility. And I just ask everyone who's thinking of engaging in this work, please do so with curiosity, please do so with humility, and please treat these ancient medicines with the respect and the care that they deserve. And I'll ask the same of myself. I think that we're all engaged in this process of learning, and we have a lot to learn. And this can be something that is a model for the rest of the country and creates a lot of good. And it's kind of on all of us in these early days in terms of how we shape this. So that's sort of my appeal to you. And then we are also linking to a number of resources here. And like I mentioned, we'll share out the slide deck after the presentation. So I encourage you to follow up and dig in a little bit more here. At some point also, you're going to have to, if you want to be a facilitator or run a business, it's going to be necessary to just read those hundreds of pages of rules. But we hope that what we provided here at least provides some context to better understand the framework and the structure of the program. And with that, we have so many questions in the chat. I want to check in with you, Barina, because I know you were going to moderate some of the questions, but we're also having some tech issues. So how are you feeling on that front?
Yeah, I'm hopped in on my phone, and I'm so sorry, guys, about the tech issues. It's been a series of unfortunate events over here. I can see some of the questions, but I can't see the ones before my Zoom crashed out. So I have a question here for Josh, but Tasha, maybe if you can think of a few others. There's probably about 40 questions that I can't see on my end right now. So I don't want to miss anything important, and I know we have limited time. I'll start by saying there's a lot of questions about if I've done a psychedelic assisted training program with this training program or that training program, and this is how far I've gotten, what applies or what kind of license can I get or what do I have to do as my next step. This is not a good format for us to answer those questions. And even in general, you should start by directing those questions to your program, because they've been intimately involved with Dora and kind of nailing down what needs to happen. So if you have any questions specific to your training program, please ask them first. And then if there's some ambiguity, us as lawyers may be able to help, but start there, because that will be the most efficient. And then Josh, one high level question for you, and we have a lot of attendees asking various versions of this. And I know some of this is undetermined, but there's a lot of curiosity about where facilitation can happen, whether it can happen in a client's home, whether it has to happen in a healing center. There's a lot of variations of that question up here.
Yeah, it's rightfully so. There's many questions about it. The current state of affairs on that issue has been in flux. What we know is that administration sessions can happen in healing centers and micro healing centers. The current draft of the rules also allow administration sessions at a participant's home. Now, that particular rule of having an administration session at a participant's home has been a subject of many conversations, and the state at one point was going to restrict that to palliative care. It doesn't look like they are right now based off of the rules posted on Dora's website. However, I expect to see more conversations about this issue and sort of more guardrails and restrictions put in place around this issue. For those who clearly want to provide administration sessions, most likely they should be looking at obtaining a micro healing center license, a healing center license, or working at a place that has a healing center license. I don't know if Tasha, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think the key distinction that I like to make is you don't need to get a micro healing center license to facilitate in this program, right? Like there will be other people establishing healing centers and micro healing centers where you can facilitate at. And so I see a lot of people thinking like every person has to pay all these fees. They don't. If you want to facilitate in your space, then that's when you would need to get one of those healing center license types. And so there's, how it's really worked in Oregon for the most part is that facilitators might work at a number of different healing centers in their area, and then they might have their own practice that's kind of separate from all of that, and they might have their own space. And so there might be echoes of that, but then Colorado also has a little bit more of an openness to these micro licenses at existing healthcare and medical practices. And then when it comes to the at-home administration piece, the only thing that I'll add is that I do think these conversations are going to be ongoing, and there's really a need for people that have specific experience in at-home care, I think, to participate in that. So I really encourage you to be following that and to kind of stay engaged if that's something that's important to you.
Great, thank you guys. One other question that is coming up, I'm trying to catch the questions that are repeating in some form or another, is who can be in the room during a session? And can there be people who are under 21 present in the room? Can there be people who don't have facilitator or clinical facilitator licenses, such as a clinical support person, like a therapist that's not a facilitator, or a musician that's neither, a clinical individual, someone with a clinical license or a facilitator? So generally, who else can be in the room during an administration session?
Take that one. So that's a great question. I think that the core of the answer to that is anyone who's going to be present in the room, all participants need to have consented in writing to their presence during the session, and then the facilitator also needs to consent to it. And so within that kind of framework, you can have other people in the room. And I believe there's actually a form specifically for a support person that might be providing, for instance, like basic mobility support to somebody at an at-home session or things along those lines that needs that. It just needs to be clear and consented to is the basic requirement.
Okay, perfect. Tasha or Josh, do you guys have questions you're seeing from earlier? I can run into a few more. They're just a little more detail oriented. We've got about 7 minutes left.
Sorry, I realized that I didn't address the under 21. So nobody under 21 can be present during the administration session. I think that's important to know. And then I didn't answer your question. Leave it to your discretion.
Okay. One question, maybe Josh, you want to cover this one? How are manufacturers allowed to transfer the medicine to the healing centers?
Yeah, there are specific rules around transportation and inventory tracking. The person who transports the medicine needs to have a handler's license, and there's specific requirements around being in a vehicle that's registered in the state of Colorado and having a transportation manifest, and those are all spelled out in the rules.
Great, thank you. One question around a mental health license. There's sort of two variations of this question I see popping up. One is if you have a mental health license or qualifying license under another state, would that qualify you to apply for a clinical facilitator license in Colorado?
You need to be licensed you need to be licensed in Colorado. So if you're a licensed professional counselor in New York and you want to be a clinical facilitator in Colorado, you have to go through our License and Portability Act to bring your professional counselor license into Colorado and become licensed as a professional counselor in Colorado, and then you can become a clinical facilitator in Colorado.
I will say
Great.
that Dora reassures that that's a fairly straightforward process, at least probably for most people. And then I know we've been getting a lot of questions about reciprocity with Oregon. So if somebody's been a licensed Oregon facilitator for at least a year, they can then directly apply for licensure in Colorado. Otherwise, if they've just completed the training in Oregon but haven't been licensed for a year, they do need to look at those accelerated training options. And that reciprocity, as of now, is just one way. It doesn't apply for Colorado facilitators to Oregon. That would be under Oregon rule.
Great, thank you. And relatedly, if someone is in process of getting a Colorado license, say as a counselor or a therapist, they would not be eligible to receive their clinical facilitator license in Colorado. Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah, sorry to ask you the question and answer. That was the sense I've gotten from Barry, that you actually have to have the Colorado license, in hand to be approved for the clinical facilitator license. Josh, a clarifying question for you. Can whole fruit be delivered directly to the healing center from the cultivation license? Or does it need to go through the manufacturing license holder?
Yeah, a cultivation facility that cultivates, and then creates dried mushrooms, and they package and label it appropriately, can deliver those to a healing center, and they do not have to go through a manufacturing facility.
Great.
And also, Josh, if I'm correct about this, all three business types can also directly transfer to a licensed facilitator as long as the facilitator explicitly states where and when the sessions are going to be taking place. And it can, as currently written, only be at participant homes. And so and then whatever's not used in the session, the facilitator needs to return back to the business. They can't hold on to it. That all?
That is, yes, that is correct. There can be direct transfers to facilitators for facilitation outside of a healing center.
At participant homes.
Yeah, at participant homes.
And not, and I think an important clarification is like not in a retreat setting, unless that retreat setting is licensed as one of the healing center license types.
Correct. And I do want to touch, and Brenda mentioned this earlier, for those who are asking questions around how do I, document being a legacy healer, what medicines count, how does this look? We are expecting the state to provide some more guidance on, what this will look like. So stay tuned. There have been conversations at the Natural Medicine Advisory Board that they don't want to see like ketamine or potentially some other substances count in that accelerated legacy healer path. But that hasn't been completely codified in rule. Also, there's a National Medicine Advisory Board committee meeting tomorrow where they're discussing creating a new definition of legacy healer. So, for those who are interested in that, stay tuned.
Great. Another question that's kind of been running throughout as a theme is questions about other medicines like ibogaine or ayahuasca. I think it's important to just clarify quickly that the regulated program only covers psilocybin and psilocin. So the regulated program that we've discussed here today, that's the topic of this webinar, does not cover ayahuasca, it doesn't cover DMT, it doesn't cover ibogaine. It doesn't cover mescaline. All of those were passed by Prop 122, and those are available to work within some pretty nuanced restrictions under personal use, but they're not covered by the regulated program. And none of those medicines can be sold. Only the medicines that are in the regulated supply chain can be sold, as prescribed by the regs right now. So I think that's just an important point to highlight. Josh, a kind of very high level question. How can someone out of state get involved was one of the questions that we received. And I think that's, a question about holding a license, but also maybe just how they can get involved in the Colorado program.
Yeah, unlike Oregon, there's no residency restrictions. So if you live from out of state, you can come become a licensed facilitator. You can fly to Colorado and provide, as a licensed facilitator and provide administration sessions. You can have an ownership interest in one of these businesses. So there's really, no restrictions on what state or what country you come from, except for like the potential immigration issues I highlighted before.
Awesome, thank you. How can people find out who the licensed healing centers are? How can they get a hold of that list?
So there will be, you can check any license or a list of licenses through Dora's website. And that's actually like how to do that is one of the links that we provide in the slide deck. But I think more broadly, there's a question like, is one of the state agencies going to offer a directory of healing centers similar to what they do in Oregon? I hope so, but I can't say for sure. Healing Advocacy Fund, we're going to try to do what we can to make that information broadly available and accessible as well. But again, there can be a lag between like as people are getting licensed and we're able to add it in. So the most updated information would be from actually checking the list for a specific license type through that Dora web link. And I just want to do a quick time check. So we have reached the kind of official end of the session, and I know folks are dropping off. So I'm good to, wrap it up soon. I also want to apologize or recognize that we haven't been able to answer about 79 questions. So we are working on additional follow-up resources, including like frequently asked questions resources that we will send out as well after this as we're able to develop them. We totally understand that there's a lot more questions than we were able to get to during this time period. There was a question about like how to engage, for instance, around the at-home administration question moving forward. What I would say is, first of all, follow our newsletter because we are sharing out regular updates about the rulemaking process and linking to kind of straightforward spreadsheet where you can follow the rulemaking process. And then we do anticipate, we're not for sure aware that this is the case, but we think there may be, further rulemaking on that subject, which would include opportunity for public comment on that and other topics that still need a little bit deeper consideration by the community.
Wonderful. And with that, I think maybe we just respect the time container and hop off unless Josh, you or Tasha have any final comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think my final comment, is that there's a lot of questions, and hopefully, we can create some more time to answer them. Some of these will become, more clear as applications come out, as additional guidelines come out. So stay tuned. And, I really appreciate everyone who's, who's moving forward with participating in this program, despite the frustrations around, lack of clarity. And I do really believe that together we can make this program really beneficial for a lot of people in Colorado and beyond.
Yeah, I'll echo that and just say we really appreciate all of you. This would not be what it is today without the efforts of so many people, way too many to name. So thank you for participating in this with us, and we're excited for license portals to open up next year and for this to all kind of take clearer shape. So with that, hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.